The chamber was thick with expectation, the kind of silence that feels alive, ready to snap at the first spark. Then it came. Richard Posner, once revered, now a towering figure with a smirk sharp enough to cut, leaned into the microphone. His words were cold, deliberate, and meant to sting. Lawyer. The phrase cracked like thunder. Gasps rippled through the room, sharp intakes of breath from onlookers who couldn't believe what they had just heard. Reporters shifted in their seats, fingers flying to keyboards. Phones tilted up as the moment was captured, frozen in the digital record forever. The air itself seemed to pause. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. Her eyes locked forward, her shoulders squared, her hands resting in quiet command. Not a flinch, not a blink. The insult hovered above her, ugly and brazen, but she didn't let it land where Posner wanted. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was defiance, the kind that comes from someone who has weathered worse and walked away stronger. Posner leaned, back with the satisfaction of a man who thought he'd landed the final blow. He had built his reputation on authority, intellect, and a brand of arrogance that dismissed anyone he considered beneath him. And now, before a crowd hungry for spectacle, he thought he had just reduced her to rubble with 2 careless words. But those watching closely saw something different. They saw Crockett's jaw tighten, the smallest signal that fire was building behind her composure. They saw in her silence not shame but calculation, woman preparing not just to respond but to devastate. Whispers began to spread across the chamber. Some murmured agreement, others hissed disapproval. The split was immediate, raw, and undeniable. For progressives, the insult was more than a jab at Crockett. It was a jab at every woman. Every black professional, every outsider who had ever been told they didn't belong. For conservatives, it was a cheer line, a power play from a man they believed still commanded the room. The insult echoed, the tension grew, and through it all, Crockett sat steady, the calm before the storm. But Posner had no idea her record in court was about to answer louder than words. This wasn't just a spat. It wasn't just one insult thrown in a crowded chamber. When Richard Posner spat out the words fake lawyer, the stakes rose. Instantly, because he wasn't some fringe commentator or partisan hack. It was Richard Posner, a man whose rulings had once shaped the very bones of American law. His words carried weight in conservative circles, where reputation and pedigree were wielded like weapons. To dismiss Jasmine Crockett in that way was to try to strip her of legitimacy, to reduce her to nothing more than a political pawn undeserving of respect. And yet, the insult wasn't truly about her alone. It was about what she represented. Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She wasn't just an attorney. She was the living embodiment of a rising generation of voices. Black, female, unflinching, unwilling to play by the rules of the old guard. To call her fake was to try to erase the communities she carried into every courtroom, every committee, every floor debate. It was establishment dismissal against grassroots legitimacy, privilege sneering down at persistence. That is why the chamber shifted. That is why the moment felt bigger than words. Because America was watching, and America has always wrestled. With this question, who gets to decide what is real and what is fake? Is it the judge who built his empire from the heights of power? Or is it the lawyer who cut her teeth defending the voiceless, the overlooked, the ignored? Crockett supporters' Posner's words weren't just an insult. They were a rallying cry. How many times had their own qualifications been questioned, their degrees doubted, their experiences dismissed? They saw themselves in her silence, in her steady refusal to break. They wanted her to answer, not with anger, but with proof that no title, no prestige, no sneer could erase the victories she had already won. And victories she had. In Texas courtrooms, she had fought tooth and nail for justice. Standing against forces far larger and more resourced than herself, and she had won. She had built her name not on borrowed privilege, but on grit and relentless advocacy. Every case, every client, every uphill battle was a line in her resume that no insult could erase. Yet here was Posner, attempting to wave it all away with one sharp phrase. The clash mattered because it exposed the larger truth. America was standing at a cultural crossroads, On one side were those clinging to hierarchy, to titles, to the old notion that authority was something handed down from on high. On the other were those who believed authority must be earned, that truth came not from who you were born as, or what title you carried, but from what you actually did. The lives you changed, the battles you fought, the victories you secured. This was more than Crockett versus Posner. It was silence versus voice, arrogance versus accountability, dismissal versus dignity. And in that room, with cameras rolling and every word destined for viral replay, the question was no longer whether Crockett could withstand the insult. The question was whether Posner's world still had the power to define hers. The crowd didn't know it yet, but the balance was already shifting. And Crockett wasn't about to let his title erase her victories. Richard Posner's name had long echoed through the halls of American law like a thunderclap. For decades, he was the judge scholars cited, the jurist law students studied, the intellectual force who reshaped arguments with a stroke of his pen. His opinions were razor-sharp, laced with wit and authority, and he relished that reputation. To many, he was the embodiment of judicial brilliance, a man whose intellect seemed untouchable. Yet brilliance often casts a shadow, and in Posner's case, that shadow was arrogance. He was revered, yes, but also feared. His sharpness, too, often crossed into condescension, his eloquence into scorn. Those who stood on the progressive side of law, women, minorities, public defenders, grassroots attorneys, learned quickly that Posner's admiration was reserved for those who mirrored his own elitist lens. If you came from the margins, if you fought battles outside the ivory tower, you weren't met with curiosity or respect. You were more likely to be dismissed, cut down, or branded with words like amateur or unqualified. This was the contradiction of Richard Posner. He preached endlessly about the law as a living, breathing entity, meant to adapt and serve society. His books filled shelves with insights about pragmatism, fairness, and the evolving needs of justice. And yet when it came to people like Jasmine Crockett, lawyers who embodied those very ideals through sweat and struggle, his instinct was to belittle, to reduce, to declare them fake. It was a pattern as old as his career. He could charm an academic conference with a sharp lecture on the law's role in democracy, then turn around and mock a young lawyer daring to question structural bias. He could pen essays about empathy and practicality, while sneering at those who brought lived experience into the courtroom. For Posner, authority was real when it came from institutions he respected: elite schools, prestigious firms, high-ranking. Judge's authority was counterfeit when it rose from communities he deemed beneath his gaze. And so, he built his empire of words and rulings, confident that his voice was the final arbiter of legitimacy. In conservative circles, he became more than a judge. He became an icon, someone whose quips could end debates before they began. His critiques carried the sting of gospel truth to those eager to dismiss progressives as unserious. To call Crockett a fake lawyer wasn't new. It was simply the latest in a long line of belittlements, sharpened to remind everyone of his power. Yet therein lay his greatest contradiction. For all his authority, for all his intellect, Posner had never been tested in the way Crockett had. He lived in courtrooms where decorum protected him, where titles insulated him, where few dared to interrupt. Crockett lived in courtrooms where the deck was stacked, where clients had little and opponents had much, where victories came not from the shield of prestige but from relentless preparation and unshakable will. This difference mattered, because while Posner wielded authority like a sword, Crockett wielded survival like armor. His dismissals might have crushed lesser opponents, but she had already heard worse and risen higher. The communities she represented had endured centuries of being told they were less than, and yet they thrived. To think one man's insult could undo that was not only arrogance, it was delusion. Still, in the moment, Posner's confidence filled the room. He believed his words would land like a hammer, that the insult would rattle her, that the audience would nod along with. His scorn, he believed in the power of reputation, the weight of his legacy, the assumption that his dismissal was enough to silence. After all, it had worked so many times before. But history has a way of shifting when arrogance grows unchecked. What worked? In theory, sneering from the pedestal of authority, can crumble in practice when confronted by someone with both the moral fire and the receipts to fight back. Crockett wasn't a law student desperate for approval. She wasn't an unknown name hoping to build credibility. She was a congresswoman, an attorney with real wins, voice carrying the legitimacy of people who had been told they didn't belong, and fought their way in anyway. For Posner, the moment seemed routine, just another display of wit at someone else's expense. For Crockett, it was a chance to prove that legitimacy is not granted from above, but earned from below. And in that collision, Posner's towering persona, revered, feared, arrogant, was about to face the one opponent he had never truly prepared for, the lived power of a woman who refused to bow. But what works in theory can crumble in practice. And Crockett had the receipts. Jasmine Crockett's story was never written in the safe margins of privilege. It was carved out of the hard edges of reality, courtrooms that didn't welcome her, clients society had discarded, and odds that were rarely on her side. Where others walked into the law as a legacy, Crockett stepped in as a fighter. Wasn't groomed by old institutions or padded with elite networks. She came from the grit of community battles, from the places where justice was not theoretical, but survival itself. Her path into law began not with ambition for prestige, but with a fire for service. As a public defender, she stood at the defense table day after day, facing prosecutors with endless resources and judges already inclined to see guilt. The scales were tilted from the start. Her clients were poor, often black or brown, often carrying the weight of stereotypes before they even entered the courtroom. Crockett knew the unwritten rules of the system. If you didn't fight tooth and nail, no one else would, and fight she did. She learned to master not just the language of law, but the cadence of humanity. She knew when to hit the books and when to look a judge in the eye and remind them of the flesh and blood life standing before them. She earned victories where they seemed impossible, dismissals in cases everyone assumed were open and shut, fair deals carved out in environments where mercy was rare, acquittals that sent ripples through communities long starved of justice. Each win wasn't just a notch in her career. It was a shield for someone who had been left defenseless, a declaration that their lives mattered. Her reputation grew, not because she played politics within the bar association or flattered the right circles. She grew because word spread. If Jasmine Crockett was your lawyer, you had someone who would treat your fight as her own. She prepared cases as if her own future was on trial, carrying binders full of notes and precedents, rehearsing arguments. Late into the night, but more than that, she carried her clients' stories with her, their fears, their hopes, their humanity. That was her edge. She didn't just know the law. She knew the people the law forgot. Over time, she transitioned. From courtroom battles to the broader fight of public service, activism came naturally. It was simply an extension of what she had already been doing, giving voice to the voiceless. She spoke at rallies, marched with communities, and reminded the powerful that dignity was not negotiable. And when the opportunity came to run for office, she carried with her not just a resume, but an army of people who believed in her. They weren't donors or lobbyists. They were single mothers she had defended, young men whose lives she had saved from being written off, families who finally felt seen. Her rise to Congress was not polished or easy. She was underestimated at every turn. Critics dismissed her as too brash, too raw, too unwilling to play the game the way it had always been played. But that rawness was her strength. It was the same energy that carried her through courtrooms where the odds were impossible, not just like in those courtrooms. She proved them wrong. Every scar she carried from those legal battles became part of her arsenal. She had stood before judges who doubted her, faced juries swayed by prejudice, and confronted prosecutors who used intimidation as a weapon. She had seen how icily power twisted narratives, how quickly dignity could be erased. But she had also seen something else, that resilience, persistence, and truth could still cut through. Each cross-examination she survived, each dismissal she won. Each moment she held her ground against sneers and dismissals. They were all training. They were all chapters preparing her for something bigger. And so, when Richard Posner sneered and called her a fake lawyer, Crockett didn't crumble. She didn't flinch because she'd been called worse in quieter rooms where no cameras rolled. She had endured the insinuations, the sideways glances, the condescension that comes when power feels threatened by authenticity. She had been doubted all her life, and she had turned that doubt into fuel. Her courtroom scars weren't signs of weakness. They were proof of survival, proof that she could take a punch from the establishment and still stand taller. Proof that, while titles and reputations can be inherited, legitimacy must be earned. And Crockett had earned it, case by case, client by client, victory by victory. It was this lived power, forged in fire, hardened by struggle, sharpened by victories against impossible odds, that stood in stark contrast to Posner's arrogance. He thought words could wound her. But Crockett had already fought wars against silence, poverty, and systemic bias. His insult was nothing compared to the battles she had already won, and it was those courtroom scars that gave her the strength to face Posner's insult head-on. The chamber grew heavy with tension, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to catch every word. Posner, emboldened by the echo of his earlier insult, sat straighter, his voice laced with smug certainty. "You parade yourself as some kind of champion," he scoffed, "but all I see is a lawyer of convenience. Figure of noise, not substance." His words dripped with the confidence of a man who believed his reputation alone could silence dissent. Crockett did not blink. Her hands rested firmly on the table, posture unyielding. Her voice carrying the weight of composure honed over years of cross-examinations. "Noise, Judge Posner," she said evenly. "I don't have the luxury of noise. My clients couldn't afford noise. They needed results." A low murmur rippled through the audience, journalists scribbling furiously, cameras flashing as though each word might crystallize into the headline of the night. Posner leaned forward, unwilling to let her have the last word. "Results? Don't mistake theatrics for results," he snapped, cutting across her sentence. The interruption landed, sharp, like a gavel slamming down. Crockett waited, not cowed, not flustered. She let the silence stretch, the audience's attention shifting toward her deliberate pause. Then she leaned in, her tone measured but undeniable. "Theatrics don't free innocent people. Theatrics don't win dismissals against systems designed to crush them. And theatrics don't build a record of victories that speak louder than insults." Gasps punctuated her words, the chamber dividing into two camps before their eyes. Conservative allies nodded with Posner's every barb, confident the establishment's old guard was still untouchable. But progressives and grassroots voices heard something else, a steady counterpunch, sharpened by truth, unafraid of his legacy. Posner bristled. "You think victories in minor cases compare to the structure of law? You think community theatrics compare to decades on the bench?" His voice, once controlled, cracked with a hint of frustration, revealing what Crockett already sensed. He was rattled. She seized the moment. "What I think," she answered, unwavering, "is that law without humanity is hollow, and a bench without accountability is just another pedestal for arrogance." The words sliced through the chamber like a knife. Some in the audience clapped, unable to contain themselves. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unused to seeing a giant of jurisprudence challenged so directly. On social media, live stream chats exploded emojis of fire and clapping hands alongside sneering comments defending Posner's authority. The clash was no longer just in the room. It was everywhere, spilling into feeds and conversations in real time. But Crockett was not finished. She leaned forward slightly, eyes locking on Posner's, her voice soft but cutting. "You want to question my legitimacy? Then let's talk about records. I carry mine in black and white in judgments, in dismissals, in verdicts that change lives. Do you really want to compare who has the stronger claim to truth?" The chamber buzzed. Journalists exchanged knowing glances, sensing the shift. Posner tried to cut in again, but this time his interruption stumbled, sounding more like desperation than authority. He waved his hand dismissively, but the gesture betrayed his unease. The old certainty, the armor of reputation, was starting to crack. Crockett pressed, her tone calm, almost surgical. "Titles may impress some, Judge Posner, But titles don't free people from wrongful convictions. Titles don't dismantle bias. Titles don't speak for the families who walk into court believing the system is already stacked against them. Every sentence landed like a hammer blow, her voice steady, his defenses slipping. The split in the room widened, cheers now erupting after each line, the energy of resistance rising. Posner shifted in his chair, his interruptions faltering, his words turning defensive instead of declarative. Crockett paused, letting the energy simmer, then leaned back slightly as though to remind everyone she was still in control. "You call me a fake lawyer," she said softly, her words hanging like a challenge in the air. "But the record says otherwise. And I think you know it." The silence that followed was electric, more deafening than any applause. Even Posner, for a fleeting moment, had no retort. And then came the line that would flip the entire chamber against him. For a moment. The room seemed frozen, Posner's dismissive sneer still lingering, Crockett's composure unbroken. But then, with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing the truth is on your side, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady, deliberate and devastatingly sharp. "Call me a fake lawyer," she said, her tone not raised, but amplified by conviction. "So let's talk about what a so-called fake lawyer has done." The chamber leaned in, even Posner, who had been eager to pounce on her every word, sat back for just a beat, sensing something was about to land. "In 2015, Crockett began, her cadence crisp. I walked into a Dallas courtroom to defend a man wrongfully accused, a man who didn't have the money for fancy representation, a man the system had already decided was guilty. I dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, and the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. That man walked free. He went home to his family. His children didn't grow up fatherless. It's not noise, Judge Posner. That's justice." Gasps broke through the chamber, followed quickly by murmurs. Warders' pens scratched furiously across their pads. Cameras zoomed closer, catching every flicker of tension. Crockett didn't stop. She let the weight of that story land, then pressed forward, each example cutting deeper than the last. "In 2017, I represented a woman beaten by police in a traffic stop gone wrong. They told her no lawyer would take her case, that it was hopeless. I took it, and I won. The city settled for 6 figures. That case forced police reforms in her district. That woman's pain was turned into accountability. It's not theatrics, that's results." The audience stirred again, this time with audible approval claps breaking out, murmurs of agreement rising like a tide. Posner shifted in his seat, his hands twitching as though reaching for a rebuttal, but none came. Crockett's eyes narrowed, her tone sharpening. In 2019, when prosecutors thought they could bully a teenager into a guilty plea he didn't deserve, I stood in that courtroom, and I refused to let them bury him. We went to trial. We won. That young man is now in college, not prison. He's building a future. Because someone fought back. The clapping was louder, harder to contain. Progressive allies nodded fiercely, whispering to one another. "She's destroying him? He can't touch her record." Crockett leaned back slightly, then drove her point home with precision. "So if being a fake lawyer means freeing the innocent, protecting the vulnerable, holding power accountable, then I will wear that title proudly. Because the people I've defended, the families I've helped, and the lives I've saved, they know the truth." The room erupted. Applause, cheers, even gasps from those who had entered the chamber skeptical of her, all crashing together in a wave that seemed to rattle even the marble walls. Posner opened his mouth, searching for a line, a retort, something to reclaim control. But his usual sharpness had abandoned him. Instead, his face betrayed frustration, a crack in the armor of a man unaccustomed to being bested. He fumbled with his notes, cleared his throat, tried to wave off her words as anecdotes. Crockett wasn't finished.
"Ow."
She pressed harder. "You talk about theory, Judge Posner," she said, her voice rising with conviction, "but I live. In reality, you sit on a pedestal and dismiss those beneath you. I sit at the table with them. I look them in the eye. I carry their fight into the courtroom, and I win." The words hit like thunder, echoing through the chamber. Even the conservative commentators in the back row, usually quick to leap to Posner's defense, sat quiet, their pens stilled, their expressions uneasy. Crockett let the silence stretch just long enough, then delivered the final blow. You call me a fake lawyer, but here's the difference between us. When I walk into a courtroom, I fight for people who have nothing, and I win for them. When you sit on your bench, you lecture, but you don't fight, and you don't win for anyone but yourself. The explosion was instantaneous. The chamber erupted into cheers, whistles, and pounding applause. Some stood, clapping wildly. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. Reporters were already tapping furiously on their phones, pushing breaking news alerts out into the world. Crockett shuts down Posner with stunning list of legal wins. Posner's composure collapsed. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched. He tried to interject, but the roar of the crowd drowned him out. Cameras caught his discomfort, the once untouchable figure, visibly shaken, staring down a congresswoman who had just turned his insult into a badge of honor. And outside that chamber, the digital wildfire had already begun. Clips hit Twitter within minutes, captions screaming, "Fake lawyer? Watch her destroy him with receipts." TikTok edits spliced his sneer against her courtroom victories, each cut a humiliation. Hashtag surged. Hashtag Crockett receipts. Hashtag fake lawyer no more. Hashtag Posner shut down. The suspense in the room crystallized into certainty. Posner had lost control of the narrative. His insult had backfired spectacularly. What was meant to belittle Crockett had only elevated her, not as a victim, but as a fighter whose record silenced even the loudest detractor. And as Crockett sat back in her chair, her expression calm once again, the audience realized something profound. Her voice had not just defended herself, it had spoken for countless others who had been dismissed, mocked, or silenced by power. She had turned insult into truth, attack into strength, dismissal into triumph. The applause continued, rolling through the chamber like a wave of vindication. But the shockwaves didn't end in that room. They spread across the nation. The moment Crockett delivered her devastating counterattack, the chamber's applause was just the beginning. By the time she left her seat, the clip had already leapt from camera feeds to millions of screens. Within minutes, hashtags began trending. Hashtag fake lawyer backfires. Hashtag Crockett wins. Hashtag speechless Posner. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all aflame with the replay of Posner's sneer dissolving under Crockett's receipts. TikTok edits turned it into a cinematic montage, his lips curling into the word fake, followed by her thunderous response. Set to booming beats and flashing captions, and I won. Meme makers had a field day, plastering Posner's stunned expression over images of collapsing statues, toppled chess kings, even WWE SmackDowns. A clip of him shuffling papers awkwardly after her takedown was set to the sound of a car alarm. Sputtering out, late-night shows latched on instantly. One host replayed Crockett's line, "You don't fight, and you don't win for anyone but yourself," before turning to the camera with mock sympathy. "Somebody get Judge Posner some aloe, because that burn is going to scar." The audience howled. Yes. Another host joked that Posner's new title should be fake winner, given how thoroughly Crockett dismantled him. But it wasn't just comedy. Commentators across the political spectrum couldn't ignore the gravity of what had happened. Progressive voices framed it as a long overdue reckoning. This wasn't just a debate, one MSNBC anchor declared. It was the establishment's arrogance finally colliding with the people's truth, and the truth won. Even more surprising were the cracks appearing in conservative coverage. Though many pundits rushed to defend Posner, others admitted the obvious. Crockett's courtroom victories spoke louder than his jab. She's got a record, and it's hard to argue with a record. One reluctantly conceded on Fox, his tone tight but honest. International outlets picked it up too. Headlines splashed across global feeds. American Congresswoman silences judge with courtroom wins, The Guardian. Viral showdown between judge and lawmaker captivates us. BBC, from Dallas courtrooms to the national stage, Crockett's voice resonates Le Monde. For a moment, the world was watching, not America's dysfunction, but its drama, its reckoning, It's hunger for voices that fight back. And for everyday people, it wasn't just politics. It was personal. Young law students flooded, saying Crockett had inspired them to keep going despite professors and mentors who told them they weren't cut out for it. Immigrant parents reposted her clips with captions like, "This is why we came here, so our children could fight back." Black women especially lifted her up as a symbol, sharing their own stories of being dismissed, underestimated, called imposters in rooms of power. Now, they had a clip 2.2, a voice to echo, "Fake lawyer, watch this." The ripple effect spread beyond social media. On college campuses, student groups organized watch parties, replaying the clip like it was a highlight reel from the big game. Hashtags turned into chants. In community meetings, activists played her speech as an anthem before rallies. And in the quiet of households across the country, families sat around dinner tables, nodding, smiling, repeating her words to one another. "I fight for people who have nothing, and I win for them." Posner, meanwhile, became the subject of relentless ridicule. Memes depicted him as speechless Posner, frozen in the moment of defeat. A parody Twitter account gained hundreds of thousands of followers overnight, tweeting things like, "Currently looking up the definition of fake lawyer. Turns out it means one who wins cases." His attempts to clarify or walk back his comments only fueled more mockery. Every statement he made was instantly quote-tweeted with Crockett's courtroom victories. What had begun as a condescending insult turned into a cultural pivot. The story wasn't just Crockett versus Posner. It was a metaphor playing out in mimetic. Real time, truth over arrogance, record over rhetoric, dignity over dismissal. The kind of drama people craved not only because it entertained, but because it validated something deeper, that ordinary voices, when sharpened by experience and conviction, could stand tall against towering arrogance. It was no longer just about a single insult. It was about every time someone had been underestimated, talked down to, or mocked for daring to stand in rooms of power. Crockett had spoken for them, and the world was listening. And yet behind the laughter and memes, something deeper was breaking through. Asterisk, as the roar of applause faded into the steady hum of news cycles and viral clips, Jasmine Crockett made a deliberate choice. She could have let Posner's collapse stand as the end of the story, her victory sealed, his arrogance punished. But that wasn't her style. For Crockett, this was never about humiliation. It was about something larger, something more lasting. She spoke again, her tone steady, her gaze unwavering. "Insults can bruise," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "But truth defends." The words weren't barbed. They weren't theatrical. They were simple, and that simplicity gave them power. In that moment, Crockett drew the line between spectacle and substance. Where Posner had leaned on arrogance, she leaned on accountability. Where he had tried to reduce her identity to an insult, she expanded the conversation into a principle that truth earned through action always outweighs titles, pedigrees, or sneers. The contrast was undeniable. Posner, once a figure revered for his sharpness, looked diminished. A man whose words rang hollow when measured against the weight of Crockett's lived victories. His sneer was remembered, but her record was celebrated. His insult was fleeting. Her dignity was enduring. Crockett understood what so many watching at home felt in their bones. This wasn't just about her. It was about the teacher dismissed as unqualified, who still inspired generations. The immigrant told they didn't. Balone, who built a business from scratch. The young activist called naive, who nonetheless changed a law. Every person who had been belittled by power, only to rise through perseverance, saw themselves in her. Her crescendo rose, not in volume, but in resonance. "Victories are not given," she said. "They are fought for, they are earned. They belong to the people whose lives they defend." It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a redefinition of what authority means. Not a robe, not a title, not a sneer. Authority comes from standing up time after time for those who can't stand alone. And with that, She transformed the clash from a personal feud into a moral lesson.
Oh.
The nation wasn't just replaying a viral exchange anymore. They were asking themselves, what does it mean to win? What does it mean to speak with legitimacy? Crockett had answered, not by tearing Posner down, by lifting the truth higher than his insult could reach. The final image was unforgettable. Crockett calm, composed, unwavering. Posner, restless, diminished, his words stripped of their sting. The roles had reversed. The so-called fake lawyer, now the embodiment of real legitimacy. The celebrated judge exposed as shallow in his dismissal, and for millions watching, the question burned. Who truly deserves the last word?
Richard.
Posner thought a single insult could define Jasmine Crockett. He thought calling her a fake lawyer would land harder than the years she spent fighting for her clients, her community, her people. But in the end, it wasn't his sneer that echoed across the country. It was her courtroom record. Her victories, her unshakable truth. If you felt that surge of justice watching Crockett turn his insult into ash, you weren't alone. Millions saw it. Millions shared it. And millions felt that same pride. The pride of knowing arrogance can stumble, but dignity stands tall. Because this was never just about one clash. It was about what America chooses to believe. Do we believe in the titles of the powerful, or in the lived victories of those who fight for us? Do we accept sneers as truth, or do we measure truth by action? Crockett gave us the answer, not with words alone, but with a record that no insult could erase. And now it's on us. If you believe that justice speaks louder than arrogance, if you believe that truth belongs to the people, not the privileged, then join us. Subscribe. Share this story. Add your voice to the millions who know that dignity isn't granted by the powerful. It's claimed by the people who rise. Because this wasn't just about a courtroom or a debate. It was about voice. It was about power. It was about who America chooses to believe. And tonight, in this moment, the choice is clear.